The average Viking man stood about 5'7". He was almost certainly shorter than you, and by the time he turned 40, his spine, his shoulders, and his knees were so worn down that if you handed a modern doctor his skeleton with no label on it, they would guess he had been 80 years old. All of that is true, and so is one more thing. He could very probably have broken you in half. Stay with this, because the strength of these people was real. It is measurable. It is sitting in museum drawers across Scandinavia right now. But it has almost nothing to do with what you have been told about it. There was no training, there was no discipline, there was something stranger and harder, and they paid for it with a price carved into their own skeletons. I will show you exactly what that price looked like, and where you can see it at the very end. First, let me set you down properly. The year is around 950, and you are somewhere in the Norse lands, a turf-roofed farmstead above a Norwegian fjord, a smoky longhouse on an Icelandic hillside, a timber-trading town like Hedeby or Birka, and you are not a raider. Set the raids aside, because they were always the work of a small, violent minority, and even for those men raiding was a season, not a life. You are one of the overwhelming majority, a farmer, a herder, a weaver, a smith, a trader's wife, and from the moment there is grey light in the sky until there is none, you are working. Notice that word, working, not training. There is no word in your language for what a modern person means by a workout, because the idea would be incomprehensible to you. Deliberately moving a heavy object for no reason, then putting it back exactly where you found it. Every heavy thing you lift gets lifted because something depends on it. Food, warmth, whether your family sees spring. So start with the ordinary day, because the ordinary day is where all of it comes from. Fences must be rebuilt, because a broken fence means livestock in the crops and a hungry winter. Stalls must be mucked out by hand, forkful after forkful. Firewood must be felled, split and carried, and a household burning a hearth fire through a Scandinavian winter goes through a quantity of wood that would shock you. Cows and sheep are milked twice a day, every day, by hand. Ropes are twisted, nets are hauled, and then there is the year's great terror, which is hay. Your animals graze the uplands through the short summer, but they cannot survive the winter outside. They must come into the barn and be fed for months out of what you cut in the summer. Every mouthful they eat between October and May, you cut by hand with a scythe, swinging it thousands upon thousands of times across a field. Then you rake it, turn it, dry it, carry it. If you cut enough hay, your animals live. If you do not, they starve, and then you starve. There is no shop. There is no delivery. The mathematics of a Norse winter is brutally simple. Your muscle in July decides whether your children eat in February. That is the engine underneath everything else. Not ambition, not vanity, arithmetic. Now multiply it by every day of a life that begins in childhood, because Norse children were never spectators. A child of 7 is already carrying water, herding sheep, gathering fuel. By the time a Norse body reaches adulthood, it has been under continuous load for well over a decade. And that matters, because bone is living tissue, not a dead scaffold you carry around. It responds to strain by laying down more bone exactly where the strain lands. Load a growing skeleton, year after year, and it does not merely get stronger, it changes shape. And then there is the oar. We know almost exactly what rowing a Viking ship cost a human body, because the Danes built one and rowed it. The Sea Stallion from Glendalough is a full reconstruction of a Viking warship, built at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde and launched in 2004. She is just over 29 metres long. She carries 60 oar positions. The oars are 4 metres long. In 2007 and 2008, a crew drawn from 10 nations took her from Roskilde to Dublin and back along Viking Age routes, 2,482 nautical miles of open water. What they learned is the interesting part. The oar positions on a real Viking warship sit so close together that a long, powerful stroke, the kind you see in a modern racing 8, driving from the legs and the back, is physically impossible. There is no room. With all 60 oars manned, the crew were forced into a short, sharp, chopping stroke pulled almost entirely with the arms. And with a 4-metre oar in your hands, that ruins you. Exhaustion arrived fast. In practice, they found it more efficient to man only half the oars, or a third, so the rest of the crew could rest. Read that again. A crew of modern volunteers, fit enough to sign up for a 2,500-mile voyage in an open boat, could not sustain what the ship was built to do. They had to take turns, and even then she made only about 3 knots under sustained rowing. 5 in a short burst. Roughly the speed of a brisk walk, produced by 60 human beings tearing themselves apart. Now imagine doing that not as an adventure, but as transport, as simply the way you get anywhere, across the North Sea, up rivers into what is now Russia, or at the rapids you climb out and drag the ship overland. And this is the same body that spent the winter hauling hay and the spring behind a plough. The oar is not their sport, the oar is their road. So here is where it gets strange. In the year 922, an Arab diplomat named Ahmed ibn Fadlan was sent from Baghdad on an embassy toward the Volga, and along that river he met a band of Norse traders, the people he called the Russ. One line of what he wrote has echoed for 1100 years. He had never, he said, seen more perfect physical specimens. They were tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy, each man tattooed from the tips of his toes to his neck, every one carrying an axe, a sword and a long knife, tall as date palms. That is the most quoted description of a Viking body in existence. Now go and measure the bodies, because we have them. Viking Age skeletons have come out of the ground across Scandinavia in their thousands, and the numbers are not mysterious. The average Viking Age man in Denmark stood about 171 centimetres, 5'7". The average woman about 158, 5'2". That is roughly 10 centimetres shorter than a Dane or a Swede walking down the street today. By modern Scandinavian standards, the Vikings were small, so Ibn Fadlan, an educated man from one of the great cities of the world, stood beside men shorter than the average American teenager and reached for the biggest word he had, date palms. He was not lying, he was seeing something. What he was looking at was not height, it was density. Ibn Fadlan came from Baghdad, a city of scholars and scribes and administrators. He had spent his entire life among people whose bodies were shaped by rooms, which, if we are honest, is what shaped yours. Then he walked into a camp full of men whose bodies had been shaped, since childhood, by oars and axes and ropes and cattle. The shoulders were wrong. The forearms were wrong. The necks were wrong. He had no vocabulary for what stood in front of him, so he reached for the tallest thing he knew. And this is the first honest thing this video can tell you. The sagas say the Norse were giants. The bones say they were short. Both are true, because what everybody was reacting to was never size. Which brings us to the fuel, where a great deal of nonsense gets sold. We do not have to guess what Vikings ate. Their diet is recorded inside their skeletons, chemically, because the food you eat becomes the tissue you are made of, and different foods carry different signatures of carbon, nitrogen and sulfur. Measure those ratios in bone collagen, and you read a person's diet centuries after they are dust. At Birka in Sweden, that has been done on the dead of the town. Freshwater fish was a stable part of the diet there across generations, and there are patterns hiding inside the population. A group of women associated with trade share one diet, while the men buried with weapons show a distinctly marine emphasis. Diet mapped onto life. In Iceland, collagen from early settlers tells the same story. Dairy, freshwater fish, marine protein. Strip it down, and the picture is this. Protein, constantly. Fish, fresh and dried and salted and hung until it was hard as wood. Milk, and what you make from it. Butter, cheese, curds, sky, sour whey. Meat from your own animals, when one could be spared. Wild birds, eggs, seals, a whale when the sea gave one up. Barley and oats and rye, as porridge and flatbread and beer. Onions, cabbage, peas, beans. Berries and honey in their season, and at no other time. And now notice what is not there. No sugar. No refined sugar of any kind, not because Vikings were disciplined, but because it did not exist in their world, and when cane sugar does finally reach the West you can watch it land in the teeth of the population like a bomb going off, with Carey's rates climbing steeply after the year 1000. No potatoes, no tomatoes, no maize. Every one of those is an American plant that will not reach Europe for another 500 years. Nothing processed, nothing between meals. Nothing engineered to make you eat more of it than you need. But do not turn this into a fairy tale either, because a study of the Viking Age dead at Varnhem in Sweden found that of 171 individuals, 83, 49%, nearly half, had at least one cavity. Bread, porridge, honey, beer and mead-rot teeth perfectly well, without any help from sugarcane. And their teeth were worn flat besides, ground down by a coarse diet of dried fish, dried meat and stone-milled grain. That detail is not small, because it points straight at the hardest physical work in the entire Norse world. and it was not done by men. Grain does not become bread by itself. Before anybody eats, somebody has to turn it into flour, and in a Viking Age household that meant the quern. 2 heavy stones, the grain between them, and a human being turning the top one by hand, hour after hour. Estimates put a skilled worker at about 6 pounds of flour an hour, 2 women working together about 10. That is 1 day's bread for a household, bought with an hour of grinding, every single day, forever. It was women's work, it was relentless, and in 2017 a research team at Cambridge, led by Dr. Alison McIntosh, did something nobody had done before. They compared the arm bones of prehistoric European women against the arm bones of living women. Specifically, the Cambridge University Women's Boat Club, athletes who at the time were training twice a day and rowing 75 miles a week. Elite rowers, some of the strongest women in the country. The prehistoric women won. Their arm bones were 11 to 16% stronger for their size than the rowers, around 30% stronger than an ordinary Cambridge student's, and the researchers' leading suspect was grinding grain. Now be careful here, because honesty matters more than a good line. Those particular women lived thousands of years before the Viking Age, but the tool did not change. The quern was still the standard household mill in the Norse world, and stayed so for centuries after. The stone was the same. The motion was the same. The hours were the same. So sit with that, somewhere in a longhouse in the year 950, in the dark, before dawn, before anybody has eaten anything at all. A woman is kneeling at a stone doing an hour of heavy resistance work with her arms and her back, and that is not her workout. That is not even her job. That is what she does before her job starts. Then she milks, then she carries, then she spins and weaves the wool that clothes every person she has ever met, thread by thread, by hand, for the rest of the day. Here is the comparison I actually want you to make, and it is not your gym session against hers. Take your entire week, every step, every staircase, every bag carried in from the car, all of it added together. Now put it against what her body had already done by breakfast, which finally brings us to the bill. Because bone remembers everything. Load it and it thickens, but overload it for years with no rest and no off-season and no retirement, and something else happens. The cartilage inside the joint wears away, bone begins grinding directly on bone, and the body desperately starts throwing out new bone around the rim to try to spread the load. That is osteoarthritis, and in a skeleton it is unmistakable. The joint surface goes glossy and polished, like something that has been sanded. Look at the tendon attachment sites too, the rough patches where muscle grips bone. Pull hard enough, often enough, and bone builds ridges exactly where the pulling happened. Bioarchaeologists have been reading those marks since the 1980s to work out what people actually did with their lives. Viking Age skeletons are covered in this. At Coppergate in York, the Viking city of Jorvik, excavations by the York Archaeological Trust between 1976 and 1981 opened up an entire Norse town, and among the human remains they found a woman. She has been given the name Leoba. She was around 46 years old when she died. She was 5'2", and she had widespread degenerative joint disease. 46, not a warrior, not a hero, somebody's mother most likely, wrecked. And in that world she was not young. The picture from Jorvik is that if you survived childhood, and a shocking number of children did not, you could hope for your 40s or 50s. Somebody between 31 and 40 was middle-aged. 50 was old. There was no stage of life in which the work stopped and the body was allowed to recover. You worked until you could not, and then you were a burden, and then you died. And thousands of years earlier, thousands of miles away, at a site called Abu Huraira in Syria, archaeologists found early farmers whose skeletons carry arthritis and injury in the toes, knees, hips, and lower back, almost exclusively among the women. The cause is well understood. Kneeling for hours every day at a grinding stone, different millennium, different continent, same stone, same joints, same bill. This is what the strength cost. It was never a bonus, it was a symptom. The Norse were strong, the way a rope is strong, right up until the moment it is not. So let us kill the last myth. The Vikings did not train, there was no strength program. There was no protein regime. The word protein would not exist for another 900 years, and no Norse person ever once chose fish for its macronutrients. They chose fish because fish was there, and fish kept. and there was certainly no horned helmet on any of it, because that helmet was invented in 1876 by a costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler for the first staging of Wagner's Ring Cycle, and it has been glued to these people's heads ever since by everyone who never met them. The truth is simpler and much less flattering to us. A Viking was strong for the same reason a farm dog is fast, because the alternative was dying. Their bodies were not a project, their bodies were a tool that the work happened to sharpen, and then kept sharpening, and then wore straight through. The shoulders that made a Baghdad diplomat reach for date palms, the forearms that pulled a 4-meter oar across the North Sea, the arms of a woman that could outmeasure an Olympic standard rower, none of it was built. All of it was survival, leaving marks. So go back to where we started. That man. 5'7", on a beach in the year 950. He is 38. He can lift things you cannot lift. He can row from dawn until dark. He has never once in his life exercised. And here is the price I promised you, and where to look for it. In his right shoulder, the one on the oar, the one on the scythe, the one on the axe that split the winter's wood. The cartilage is already gone. The bone has been polished smooth as glass by the bone grinding against it. And around the rim, a rough collar of new bone is still growing, still spreading, as his body tries, uselessly, to share out a load that has never once let up. He has perhaps 8 years left, and he will work every one of them.